Hello, students, and welcome back to Anthropology 333, Anthropology of the Developing World. This week we're going to be talking about Bodley Chapter 5, the extension of government control. And in many ways, this chapter is going to continue the discussion that we started last week about how state-level governments bring indigenous groups within colonial control. And previously, we've talked about what are some of the aims and philosophies of these colonial governments as they attempt to colonize indigenous people. Many of the official statements about government control over indigenous populations included statements that were framed as positive benefits for indigenous people, including how they were going to bring indigenous people peace, health, happiness, and other benefits of civilization. But despite these well-written proclamations, in reality, much of what was going on in this time was about protecting the settlers and their economic interests while expanding colonial control into areas previously controlled by indigenous people. And this is because independent tribal people were viewed by colonial governments as threats to government authority and sovereignty. These governments also described these tribal people as national minorities who were a threat to the stability of the nation. The use of the terms national minorities or ethnic minorities was a purposeful one by colonial governments, and it was used to undermine the claims of indigenous groups for the rights to their homelands. And the extension of government control was a historic process. It doesn't happen all at once. In the early days of colonial settlement, most tribal groups were recognized as small, independent, sovereign nations. But despite this recognition of indigenous sovereignty, over time, colonial powers gradually transferred sovereignty either by force or by signed treaty from these indigenous governments to colonial ones. And we can see this process happen all over the world around the same time, at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. In the United States, this change happened about 1871, when the United States Congress passed a law saying they would no longer make treaties with tribal governments. Similarly, in 1899 and 1904, the French followed suit. Likewise, in 1914, British lawyer John Westlake proposed giving sovereignty to indigenous groups only if they protected white settlers within the area. And much of this control was a switch over from the earlier wars of extermination that we talked about in Chapter 4. Even as early as 1888, the Institute of International Law rejected the idea of indigenous people as wards of the state, and they condemned the wars of extermination held by colonial governments against indigenous communities. Rather, they advocated for minimizing indigenous sovereignty within the larger colonial empire. And so for the remainder of this lesson, we're going to take a more in-depth look at the processes by which colonial governments used to bring indigenous people from sovereign nations to colonial subjects. And oftentimes, the first step in this process was treaty making. Treaty making often happened just after the conclusion of the wars of extermination that we talked about last time. And many times, these treaty making ceremonies were marked with a formal surrender of indigenous people to the colonial governments. At the same time, these treaty making ceremonies often included prestations of gifts from the colonial government to local elites as a way to buy their acquiescence. And many times, these tribal leaders acted in their own self-interest rather than for the good of their people when signing these treaties, in order to acquire material wealth or social prestige within the new colonial empire. Other times, either the local officials or the colonial governments didn't really understand what was going on, but signed the treaties anyway. For example, many tribal leaders didn't speak or read English, but were forced to sign the treaties anyway, without really understanding what they were signing. In other cases, colonial governments had people sign treaties who weren't actually the leaders of their tribe, but rather the leader of a small family band or a clan. And this often led to confusion later when the rest of the tribe didn't understand why they were being attacked for breaking a treaty they never signed. And once these treaties were signed, colonial officials began quickly to establish ways of bringing these indigenous people within the larger empire. And government officials attempted to bring indigenous communities within the larger empire by setting up the functions in government within these communities, including appointing political authority over them, imposing the state's ideas of law and order, including police and imprisonment, levying and collecting taxes, instituting military recruitment, collecting census data, and expanding the national education system and services. And all these different processes helped bring indigenous people within the larger surveillance of the national or international government. And the process by which indigenous groups were politically integrated into colonial empires through the extension of government control was a highly significant event in the history of indigenous people. The political integration of indigenous communities into colonial system affected these indigenous people in many different ways, including being forced to conform and integrate into the colonial society, as well as a loss of autonomy related to political decisions and settling disputes. But despite the fact that this political integration process happened all over the world, there was a lot of variation on how colonial governments would run tribal populations. And next up, Gabrielle is going to talk to us a little bit more about two of those different ways that colonial governments attempted to maintain control over indigenous people: the difference between indirect rule and direct rule.
Hi, everybody. So today we're going to be discussing indirect and direct rule and a couple examples and what that looks like in governments and in different countries and societies. So indirect rule. As you saw in your PowerPoint, by the 1920s and 30s was considered to be the only approach to local administration of tribal people. And the people who perfected the use of indirect rule were the British, Russia, the Chinese, and the Americans. So when we see indirect rule, it usually contains maintaining or strengthening tribal leaders, creating tribal leaders if they didn't already exist in a society. And so what that really looks like is, if we take in America, Native American culture and societies, it's basically keeping the war chief and the tribal head and elders and keeping them in place in order to be the governing body through them. So it's basically having them be the bad guy and be the guy behind them whispering in their ear. And so, and again, as your PowerPoint stated, tribal councils, clans, villages were recognized as legal entities. And this was done as a way to keep control without looking heavy-handed. So we see this in the Americas, but we also see it with the British. The British also do this when you look at the Caribbean. As you know, that they still have and are maintaining the Caribbean, and they are the governing authority, even though they do have governors and they have governing bodies. They have judicial courts and judges as well, who still have authority, as you would see in America. However, the Queen and the Prime Minister still give authoritative permission to those governing bodies of what can and cannot be done. When you contrast that to looking at from indirect rule to direct rule, it's a direct hands-on approach. And so direct rule is literally all authority is held by outsiders. And so we see examples of this of the French. The French are a great example. The French, of all the colonies that they took over and all of the tribal societies and indigenous peoples that they went and conquered, they reigned heavy-handedly. They were inputting all of their people and government authority into their societies. If there were no courts and judicial procedures in place, they inputted those people so that there were people in those specific places. The idea was basically to create control rapidly and restrict the indigenous peoples from their traditional rights and authority. And so you saw this control in every aspect of tribal life. They controlled what they wore, when they went places, what religion they focused and used. It was a heavy-handed approach. That's all it comes down to. It was a very heavy-handed approach. They had full discretion on tribal justice and used majority of the time colonial law. So whatever the reigning authorities' law was, that's what they used in those tribal societies, regardless if it fit the context of the tribal culture or the crimes that were committed in that time. And so that's usually what you see. A lot of countries actually used indirect, but you see this kind of switch as well when you talk about direct. It's a really focused attempt to control. So indirect is more of a behind the scenes approach, and it's done with a little more grace behind the scenes and dignity for the indigenous communities in which they are colonizing. However, direct rule is a hard, heavy-handed approach of showing their authority and their weight. So that's the difference between indirect rule and direct rule.
Thanks, Gabrielle, for that great explanation of the differences between direct rule and indirect rule. And when indirect rule was applied by colonial governments, there was a need for information about how tribal societies operated and who was in charge in order for indirect rule to be applied efficiently. This knowledge made tribal management more efficient and prevented tribal uprisings. So, throughout the world, colonial governments created departments of ethnology and ethnography in order to study these native people and in order to best rule them. And this led to the creation of the Bureau of American Ethnology, as well as one within the British Empire as well. These early anthropologists provided government administration with information about things like the socio-political organization of tribes, their systems of law and judicial process, their land tenure system, as well as problems relating to economic development. And while the collaboration between these early anthropologists and colonial governments is a dark stain on the discipline's history, it's important for anthropologists now to do their best to help Indigenous people to right the wrongs of the past in their struggle for Indigenous self-determination. And finally, today, we're going to take a look at the protective legislation approach employed by many colonial governments, especially in cases where tribal people were outnumbered by invading populations. In these cases, Indigenous people weren't often used for labor because there wasn't very many of them in the first place. Instead, local administrations tended to become welfare operations to preserve the remaining populations. And in these welfare operations, Indigenous people were treated as incompetent and impoverished citizens, sheltered by special institutions and managed by special legislation rather than giving them self-determination. And in these cases, often normal laws were suspended as a temporary measure to allow tribal people to become integrated within colonial society. And we're going to take a look in a couple weeks at some of the ways the governments tried to do that through changing Indigenous people's laws, customs, religion, and language. Well, that's going to wrap up this discussion of Chapter 5 of Bodley, the extension of government control. As always, if you have any questions about the materials or the readings this week, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much for stopping by this week, and I'll see you next time.